Um,
You're welcome.
by way of background, so my name is Andrew Heisz. I'm the Assistant Director of the Income Statistics Division at Statistics Canada. So my division is responsible for survey and census and administrative data programs related to mainly to income, but also some programs related to expenditures and wealth and housing. So we have quite a variety of different products that we're responsible for. For example, the Canadian Income Survey comes from my division. The Survey of Financial Security comes from my division. The Survey of Household Spending comes from my division. So these are all pretty big data products, which all in their own way aim to shed some light on the economic well-being of Canadians. The biggest one, of course, is I'm also responsible for the census income program, which probably many of you are familiar with from the perspective of the data user perspective, as the census, of course, allows you to drill down to small areas such as municipalities or communities. And likewise, my division is also responsible for the T1 family file, which is another data bank that some of you are probably familiar with, which is an administrative data bank based on tax records that have been linked together and into families, and you can use that to describe economic well-being at the neighborhood level as well. So that is by way of my background. What I'm here to talk to you about today is this entitled Understanding Canada's New Poverty Line, the Market Basket Measure. The Market Basket Measure, of course, is one of the three different measures of low income that we measure at Statistics Canada. It's perhaps it's definitely the newest one, and maybe it's the least. It's becoming more well known. Let me just say that it's becoming more well known. So there's a lot of interest in this measure, in no small part due to the announcement of this particular measure as being Canada's official poverty line. So the way I'm going to plan things out is I have about 30 slides in my presentation, and I'd say that it follows through maybe 4 or 5 different sections. And so sort of a background, and then I walk through some of the different parts of the market basket measure, and pose some rhetorical questions here and there, which can provide you with some food for thought, maybe spur some feedback, and hopefully get some good feedback from you, because one of the things that we're really engaged in right now is a big consultation activity around this market basket measure. So I'll tell you all about that as we go along. I'm sort of looking over at this corner little screen here on the chat side, and if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to type it in and send it to me, and then when I get to those pause points, I can go back and review the questions, and that way, we don't have silence while I'm waiting for you to type it in. Feel free to just fire away at will, and we'll try and get through everything. Likewise, it's not just questions that are interesting. Opinions are also interesting. So if you see something or hear something that causes you to want to state your opinion on something, please feel free. Whether it's something that you agree with or something that you disagree with, I'm interested in hearing your feedback. Okay, so that gets me onto slide 2. Now I'm assuming here that when I do this, you all see the second slide. So if that didn't just happen for you, then let me know. Yes, the slide advances. Thank you, Cam. Okay, so I mentioned this already, but back in the late summer of 2018, the Government of Canada, through Employment and Social Development Canada, released a poverty reduction strategy for the first time in Canada's history. This document was called Opportunity for All, and it's available on the Employment and Social Development Canada website. And it's a very interesting piece, and it does a few things which relate to what I'm talking about today. So the first thing that it does, or one of the things that it does, is it establishes Canada's official poverty line. So in the past, Canada has never had an official poverty line. And yes, there's no reason why you couldn't have, sorry, Jillian, yes, you can have the slides. So we can send those after, I suppose. Oh, Mary's going to do that. Okay. So establishing Canada's poverty line. In the past, Statistics Canada and the Government of Canada has never really had an official poverty line. We have things that we call low-income lines or low-income measures. And Statistics Canada has always indicated to its users that Statistics Canada doesn't define poverty. Rather, poverty is a question of social consensus. It's to be articulated through the Government of Canada, and so Statistics Canada would continue to measure low income, but if the Government of Canada decided on an official poverty line, then we would measure that as well. So the 2018 position piece stated that the market basket measure would be Canada's official poverty line, and it would be used for the purposes of monitoring poverty reduction. I'll talk about the rebasing of MBM in a couple of minutes. So the poverty reduction targets and legislation uses a baseline of 2015, which was, I guess, to coincide with the first year of the current government. And the targets were to reduce the rate of poverty by 20% by 2020, and then by 50% by 2030. And these targets are aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Also an opportunity for all, they created a National Advisory Council on Poverty. That council, I don't believe, has been, the membership hasn't been announced yet. But that council will help to guide policy on poverty, as well as I guess watch and analyze the trends as they go forward. And then the third bullet there is to create a data and measurement plan. And the objective there is to supply some funding to Statistics Canada to develop and improve data to measure poverty and to inform policy decisions. So what exactly is this market basket measure? The market basket measure, and I'll get into a lot more detail on this during the course of the presentation. The market basket measure will be used as the basis for the official measure of income poverty. It'll be referred to as Canada's official poverty line. The MBM is calculated based on the costs of a basket of goods and services that individuals and families require. Interestingly, my slide just got, there we go, it just got bigger and then smaller again. So basically it's constructed out of cost of goods and services that are deemed to be necessary for leading a good standard of living. Sometimes the buzzwords basic and modest standard of living are used to describe the sort of level of living that is targeted by the market basket measure. The basket would include items such as healthy food, appropriate shelter, maintenance required for your home, clothing and transportation, as well as some room for other goods and services that would permit engagement in the community. The market basket measure reflects poverty thresholds for 50 regions across Canada currently. With the changing in the population, it's entirely possible that in the future there could be more. And it also will be expanded through this data and measurement plan to include the 3 territories. So up to now, we've not had a market basket measure for the Northern Territories, but as part of this exercise, we will. And I see that there's a lot of questions coming in. I'm really glad to see that. So I'll get to those in just a couple of seconds when I have that sort of pause point that I was describing to you. So if you want to keep typing, that's great. There are 4 major elements of the data and measurement plan that were funded to Statistics Canada, and the first one is to fund what we call a comprehensive review of the MBM. So that's what actually this conversation here that we're having today would be considered part of this comprehensive review. A comprehensive review is a period that takes place should happen on a regular basis, wherein we reconsider the components of the market basket measure and ask if we need to change any components or change any of the methodology to make it more reflective of this basic modest standard of living for contemporary times that we're looking for. That comes back to a question, I'll just raise it now, that Valentin raised about how often the MBM will be rebased. So the MBM, I'll mention in a minute, was last rebased in between 2008 and 2010. And so now we're working with an MBM that's about 8 years old. But the intention, as I understand it in the future, will be to rebase it every 5 years. And so right now we're working on a rebasing to reflect the standard of living in 2018. Sorry, I just have a little pop-up on my screen here. Oh yeah, I remember now. Just trying to get rid of it. Good. We also, through the data management plan, received funding to increase the sample of the Canadian Income Survey in provinces and extend it to the territories. So for the first time, we're extending this annual survey of income into the territories. And we've also increased the sample in the provinces by 50%. That'll allow for better and more precise estimation at the provincial and better estimation for large municipalities anyways. Although I understand that for smaller municipalities and community level work, there's still going to be a reliance on the census and large administrative files. We've also, through the data measurement plan, identified funding for research to improve poverty measurement, income measurement, and timeliness. So, thinking of those, we could be looking at, say, for example, how to incorporate income that's implicitly received from social transfers in kind, for example. So if somebody receives, if you have one family that's receiving money for housing as a check, it gets counted for income. But if another family is receiving money in terms of rent geared to income, then they don't receive a check, so it doesn't get counted. So we could look into ways of maybe leveling the playing field there. Likewise, timeliness is critical. Right now, well, I can speak to last year for sure. We released our income survey data about 14 months after the end of the reference period, and we're aiming to improve that timeliness over time. And then finally, the funding included adding some extra indicators. So two specifically that are being added to the Canadian Income Survey are elements of food security and unmet healthcare needs. So for the future, we'll be able to look at data on income, housing, which is already collected in the Canadian Income Survey, food security, and unmet healthcare needs for, I think, key components of poverty, broadly speaking. We'll be able to look at all four of those using data from the same survey. Poverty has trended downward in recent years. So this is just what the MBM rates look like from 2010 to now. And especially in the last couple of years, although it was a bit of a hiccup up in 2015, there's been a steady decline in the market basket measure rate for all persons, and for children, not as much for seniors, although the incidence of the market basket measure rate, poverty rate, is fairly low for seniors. And it varies importantly among different groups as well. So looking at the small chart on the left, males and females are about the same. Oh, sorry, this particular graph is for seniors, so persons 65 years of age and over. And so, seniors who are living alone have a much higher poverty rate than seniors living in a couple. Seniors living in owned accommodation have a much lower poverty rate than seniors living in rented accommodation, which is obviously reflective of other aspects of their life as well. Seniors who are Aboriginal persons, seniors who immigrated in the last 10 years, and to a lesser extent, seniors who have a disability also have higher poverty rates than the overall. And this particular graph looks at seniors, but the same pattern would be seen if we were to look at all persons or or even different family types. This poverty rate also varies regionally. So it goes, tends to be higher in the east and lower in the prairies. We see that there's the differences among the large municipalities in terms of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver in the poverty rate, and it's a little lower in rural than other areas. Actually, this element of comparing poverty across regions, I think, is one of the strengths of the market basket measure. Because, as I said before, the market basket measure refers to prices in 50 regions across Canada. It's more attuned to local prices than the alternative measures that we use, such as the low-income measure and the low-income cutoff, which are less attuned to local prices. This graphic here sort of demonstrates that. For example, you see that the trends in the limb, you have the highest low-income rate for Toronto, a little lower for Montreal, a little lower still for Vancouver. The LICO is sort of declining from Montreal to Toronto to Vancouver. And the MBM, the trends are a bit different with Toronto and Vancouver standing above Montreal. And perhaps, at least from people that I've shown this graph to before, that particular picture resonates with them. They understand that cost of livings are higher in Toronto and Vancouver than in Montreal, and on the face of it, you would think, therefore, that the poverty rates would be higher there as well. The graphic on the right shows the relative prices from the Consumer Prices Index, which show the same thing, that prices are higher in Toronto and Vancouver than they are in Montreal. And so this responsiveness to local prices is a strength of the MBM that's not really built in the same way or as well with LIM and LICO. So thinking about things from a community perspective, or thinking about things from a interprovincial or intermunicipality perspective, the market basket measure, because it tries to build up this basket based upon local prices, is more responsive to differences across regions. I'm going to look a little bit ahead here because I'm seeing a bunch of questions. I'm going to pause now, and I'll go through and maybe a couple of questions I'll just say I'm coming to it, and other questions I'll answer right now. But I'm just going to look through, and I'm going to go back up to the top here. Okay, so Valentin, I also already mentioned what the schedule is for the rebasing. My expectation is that it'd be rebased every 5 years. So this year we're working on a 2018 base, and so then it would be rebased again for 2023, and so on. Ruth, have any provinces adopted this poverty line, or do you know if they will? So I am aware that in my consultations with the provinces and territories, that the provinces use the market basket measure of low income. I think that they probably also use the low income measure, and they may even use the LICO. Whether they've adopted them as poverty lines or as part of their poverty reduction strategies, I can't answer that question, but certainly this is a measure that is well known to them. Cheryl, how does a municipality practically use MBM as a poverty threshold when there is no document a resident can present with their disposable income? Or is there no intent for it to be used for this purpose? That's a very, very good question, and it's something that it's been phrased to me in different ways. The way it's usually phrased to me is something along the lines of, and not as a question, but as a statement, where I'm told that local organizations may choose to use the market basket measure as a sort of a threshold whereby they can for program eligibility, and how would that work? And my answer is always really kind of the same. Like, I appreciate the desire to use them that way, but I understand that it would be difficult. you're right that people generally wouldn't know what their own disposable income is as we define it. I personally would have a hard time even knowing exactly how it's done, stating what my disposable income would be. I think, from my own experience as a survey taker, we know that people are fairly they can report, say, their pre-tax income, but it's much harder for them to report their post-tax income because they're not always keenly aware of how much their income taxes are altogether when you consider all the different deductions and stuff that are available on the T1. So I appreciate that comment and the question. What we usually say at Statistics Canada is that we don't define the thresholds for that purpose. We understand that other organizations may use them for the purposes of defining eligibility, but we don't define them for that purpose. Can we show you, Doug? Can we show us a map of the 40 regions? Well, 50, and it's actually hard to do that because the way the regions are defined is you start off by taking the largest metropolitan areas of the country. So you have your Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, Quebec City, a couple of other big municipalities, and they each have their own MBM thresholds. And then when you get into the next tier of more large but medium-sized, or large and medium-sized municipalities, they're often grouped together. So in Ontario, perhaps London, Waterloo might be grouped together in a sort of a medium-large size region. And then when you get into smaller communities, it can get even more disjointed in a sense. So we don't produce a map of the 40 regions, although it could be something that we could aim to try doing in the future. Yeah, 50, no problem. How will the home ownership cost be estimated? Okay, I'm going to come back to that one, Valentin. It's a pretty big part of my presentation later on. Our food security and unmet healthcare needs to be extracted from the income survey in place of the CCHS. No, there's no plan to replace them off of the CCHS. This is done independently of the measures in the CCHS. So my understanding is that they continue to be on the CCHS as they have in the past. Can the MBM be adjusted for household size? Yes, it can. So the basic MBM is at first defined for a family of size 4. I think I'll describe that a little bit more in the coming slides. So it's built on a family of size 4, and then it's adjusted upward and downward using what we call equivalence scales to different family sizes. Pam, well, rural in each province is one region, yes. So there are like small towns are taken out from the rural, and then you have what's left is the rural. So rural is kind of the it's the collection of municipalities that are smaller than small town. So what you end up with is each province has a region that you call rural. Each province has a region that you call small town, and then there's medium-sized cities, larger cities, and then there's these other communities, the larger cities that I mentioned before. I'll come back to the question on will contents of the basket be updated, and what is a small town? It's defined by the size range of the municipality. I wish I could remember off the top of my head what the cutoff is, but it's pretty straightforward and standard, at least from our perspective, the way we do it. So I'll take this one last question and then I'll move on. So is there a reason there is not a rural and a northern rural? Not right now. There is not a reason for that. And one of the things that we've heard from other users is that it would make sense to have some reflection of remoteness built into the market basket measure. And I'll come back to that perhaps in another point in the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slides. Thank you all for your questions and comments. I'll come back to my slides, the MBM comprehensive review. So as was sort of suggested already in some of the things that I've said and some of the questions we've received, Modest basic standard of living can change over time. So it's determined that the MBM methodology should be rebased on a regular basis. It's informed by the results of this comprehensive review. Following the comprehensive review, baskets can be adjusted to reflect contemporary circumstances, and necessary methodological updates are made. So examples for this is, do we want to adjust the baskets to respond to, say, changes in the best food science, for example. Let's say we look at our food basket and say, there's too much processed food in here. Really, for the best food science suggests that we should be doing something different, so we could adjust the basket for that. Likewise, necessary methodological updates could be made if there are changes in necessitated by the underlying data, or if we were to determine that things could be better done by doing it a different way. I mentioned that the last rebasing was in 2008-2010, and that right now we're creating a base year for a reference year 2018. Our timeline for this. So right now we're in the midst of, we're actually in this various outreach activities. We hadn't done really much in January, but up to through October, November, and December, we were very, very busy. We were meeting with different provincial and territorial partners, federal partners, and making ourselves available to discuss issues with communities such as yourselves. And the calendar year of 2019 is really about absorbing everything that we're hearing in these outreach activities and then developing 2018 base. The intention is to publish the 2018 base in early 2020. So that'll provide us with new low-income estimates, or new poverty estimates, if you will, for 2015 to 2018. In the time being, for reference to poverty measures, we would just use the 2008 base that exists right now. So our activities to date, we've got quite a number of different interesting things. We had a very rich set of face-to-face and focus group interviews with Canadians with lived experiences of poverty. We visited all provinces and territories, and through Statistics Canada has a particular function of, they're kind of like professional methodologist interviewers that are well versed in running cognitive interviews or focus groups. And so we arranged through some of our regional offices to have focus groups and face-to-face meetings. We met with over 250 Canadians with various lived experiences of poverty, and asked some questions about how they live in order to gain some information back to help us to reset the 2018 market basket measure. So there was lots of useful information that was gathered from that. We're just in the process of combing through all of that information right now, and we'll be able to talk more fully about that in the future. We also conducted an online survey to gather views on the MBM, which was open to all. I wish I could say it was still open. Actually, it was open for about 4 months, and it just closed in the February 1st. So that was really a great exercise for us. We received inputs from more than 9,000 Canadians. And the structure of that online survey was anybody who wanted to could go and anonymously fill out a few questions for us. And many of the questions were based around the ideas of, what we did was we collected from people, the only information we collected from people was what region of the country that they lived in, as well as what their family size was. And with that information, then we could feed back to them what the appropriate poverty thresholds would be for them. And we asked them then if those seemed about right, or if they were too high or too low. And if they were too high or too low, but how much too high or too low were they? So we got all kinds of really good responses from that. And again, we're going through all of that and absorbing all of the information. And that information will also feed into the consultation recommendations overall. I mentioned the workshops with provincial, territorial. We also met with academic and NGO communities. And activities such as this, which we'll just call them ad hoc activities where they're requested. So gathering together a ton of information. Well, this was to be my first pause, but I just saw there were so many questions there. I thought I'd kind of clean up the chat box first. So I'll go back to the chat box here before I continue on to talk about the market basket measure in more detail. Okay, so start with this City of Calgary. Are there plans to engage with municipalities as part of the rebasing of MBM? Exercises like this, of course, are opportunities for us to do that, and also we would like to engage with the municipalities. So there's certainly an open opportunity. My email, or actually we have an open email. Market basket measure email at the end of this presentation. I encourage you to dial to send us an email. We'd be more than happy to have a teleconference or work with whichever city or community that wishes to speak with us about it. So Ivan, CDP should be a representative of the NGO city user community. That's a good point. Hopefully, this conversation today can spur more conversations in the future. Question from Banff: how are small communities who currently don't have access to a local MBM going to be a part of this? The costs for our local market are quite different from the other comparable communities. Does this move toward? Does the move toward the MBM mean they will conduct the survey in each community across Canada now? Many from our area have been advocating for years for them to include Banff in their methodology, and of course it hasn't been possible to do everywhere. So, Michael, there's really two parts to the MBM, and both of them offer constraints. The one side, which is defining the thresholds, which I'm going to talk about next, and then the other side, which is defining the income and the survey, if you will. Both of those are constraints in the sense that we can't define a basket for all communities, although we could perhaps do more granularity than what we do now. And then on the income side, you need a survey or census that's big enough to provide meaningful information from to compare Banff and Canmore. So something like the census or the T1 family file provides you with that income. But even there, it's you mentioned in your email the cost of the local markets. Well, that's going to be hard in the future for that to be definitely reflectable all the time. Perhaps in the future as we develop new methodologies, we can start to reflect maybe some more smaller areas. But at the same time, there's sort of a need to be parsimonious and to be able to aggregate up. So I understand the concern though. Ainsley, is there a plan to gather feedback on finalized 2018 before official release? So we're working on this in partnership with Employment and Social Development Canada. I think right now there's not a plan to gather further feedback on the final 2018 measure, but that doesn't mean there won't be any. It's perhaps just in my mind, it's just a little early to say what we're going to be doing as attempts to gather further feedback on a finalized 2018 measure. I'll have to hold that question. Does the market basket reference the Fraser Institute's MBM work done by Professor Sarlo? So Professor Sarlo also builds a basket-based poverty line. And I suppose it does some things similarly and some things differently. I suppose one clear difference that they do is with the results for the Sarlo line tend to lead to thresholds that are lower than the market basket measure. Certainly, we're aware of the work of Professor Sarlo, although it doesn't explicitly reference it. Going back to the questions, what type of groups were included in the face-to-face? Well, we use local recruiters, often through different organizations. I don't have all of the detail on what kinds of groups. We tried to find individuals who were in lived experience of poverty. We did have criteria with the recruiters to get a cross section of Indigenous and immigrant families, as well as seniors and young people. I guess I really can't say anything beyond that. Is it possible to add MBM to the health indicators that are provided for health regions? Yes, certainly. The MBM can be defined, like the MBM rates can be defined, for any region that the data supports. So if you receive, is it possible? So if you receive information on health regions from the Canadian Community Health Survey or from the census, the MBM could be organized by health region as well. So that would be the MBM rate. So that'd be the rate of people in poverty. And Ruth has provided a link to health indicators. Can you tell us how many regions are within each province or territory? It differs depending on, Ontario, for example, has 2 large cities that are represented, plus an additional 6 city sizes. So there's 8 in Ontario, but there's smaller numbers in some other provinces. Yes, that's what so Gary's provided the population center ranges. Thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate that. So those are the ranges for the MBM. So you have rural, which is smaller than small, I guess, and then you have the small, medium, large, urban, and then your largest communities are represented individually. Okay, so I'll continue on. We're at the end of the questions there. So for the remainder, I looking at down about slide 11 out of 30. So for the remaining 20 slides, I'm going to walk through the different parts of the MBM so that you get a better appreciation or understanding for the way the MBM thresholds are defined. So thinking about this first graph here, what this shows is the MBM thresholds for a family of 4 as of 2016. Sorry for the very, very tiny font. But you can see that they range geographically. The lowest one is a value in Quebec with the population of around 30,000 to 999,000. Sorry, 99,999. And the highest MBM threshold is in Toronto at I'm trying to read that number myself. It looks like about $42,728 in 2016. So those are the 50 regions going from coast to coast. And as I mentioned before, the building of the thresholds is done from the bottom up. So we build the thresholds based upon 5 components: a food component, a clothing component, a shelter component, a transportation component, and something we call an other expenses component. And that gets us to the total threshold. All of those are probably fairly clear, but the other expenses component is meant to account for other things that you need to lead a basic moderate standard of living. It can include a variety of different things, including paper goods, toiletries, items for babies, lots of different things like that, toys, entertainment, going to see movies, that kind of thing. And the way that it's done is it's set according to the needs of a reference family. So we determine what the reference family is: a family with 2 adults and 2 children. They're aged 9 and 13. And then we build up what an appropriate food component is for them: a clothing, a shelter, a transportation, and other expenses. And then we price those out in as great a detail as we can for each of these 50 regions. Baskets for other family sizes and types are established through what we call a square root equivalent scale. So this is a method of scaling this basket value up and down to be appropriate for smaller size families or larger size families, but it's not simply dividing it out. So a family of size 2 does not have exactly half of what need exactly half of what a family of size 4 would need. In fact, they would need more because they can't, share. A family of 4 can share things like rent and utilities across more people, whereas a family of 2 can't do that. So it's sort of the square root equivalent scale means that the threshold values decline on a sliding scale, if you will. And then, as I mentioned before, part of the current activities to develop MBM thresholds for the territories. So looking at this pie chart shows you approximately the shares of the different major components that make up the MBM. So here we have about, so there's some magic going on the screen here in the background. It's moving around like crazy. I'm not doing that, by the way. So the pie, what we have here is you have your food component, your clothing component, transportation, shelter, and other expenses. The food component takes up about 32%. The second largest is the other expenses component. Shelter component is the third largest component at 25%, and clothing and transportation take up the remaining portions. So I'm going to go through each of these components in turn, and I'll take some time after. I'll do two at a time. I'll do food and clothing, and then I'll pause. And that'll give us all a chance to talk through a lot of the details around the food and clothing, and then we'll move on to the shelter and transportation, etc. So how is the food component done? So of course, in order to determine what's appropriate for people to eat, you have to refer to some kind of standard. The standard can be developed by experts. It can be developed with reference to a survey, and probably there are a lot of different standards out there. The one that's used in the market basket measure is the National Nutritious Food Basket, which is derived by Health Canada. It was last derived in 2008, and of course it's sort of married to the Canada Food Guide. So the Canada Food Guide, of course, is in the news again now because Health Canada has just completed a new Canada Food Guide, and so shortly after the Canada Food Guide, they usually release what they call the National Nutritious Food Basket. So this NNFB represents a nutritional diet with healthy foods that people like to eat. So it tries to find, and I hate to speak for the experts at Health Canada, but this is how I understand it. It tries to find that balance between healthy foods and things that people are actually buying. So it uses information from surveys as well as from dietitians to choose a basket that would be appropriate for this family of four. But I'd like to underscore that it's not a shopping list. It's not the cheapest diet that meets nutritional requirements. The first item is important because it's meant to be amount of money required to buy a diet, but it doesn't mean that this is the diet that people have to buy or should be buying. It's not meant that way. People can substitute out items or get other foods. That's not the intention, is to be prescriptive on what people should be buying. And it's also not the cheapest diet. It's healthy foods. It's not the cheapest food to get the calories that people need. It's meant to be an acceptable diet. So like it said there in the last bullet, it's designed to be socially acceptable and contain sufficient variety to be nutritionally adequate and palatable over the long term. So how do we calculate this basket then? So we start with the NNFB, the National Nutritious Food Basket, and it's defined for 38 cities. And we go out and we say, okay, the NFB says that a family needs these items in these quantities on a weekly basis, and it needs these items in these quantities on a monthly basis. And so we go out and we price these food items at a detailed level. So if it's hamburger, if it's romaine lettuce, if it's mustard, whatever the item may be, we find the price for it, and we do it at the appropriate quantity. So you need this much of this and this much of that, and this is expected to last you for this long, and all of those things, and then we price it up to get you to a final amount for these baskets. It's priced in 38 cities, and then those 38 cities are in some cases meant as proxies for other close by areas. We work with our prices divisions who help us to determine where we should be pricing these and what the closest approximation is for an area that maybe we don't have direct prices for, so that we can have something that's close for them. And as I mentioned, that the quantities are given by the National Food Basket. So we collect the prices and the quantities are from the National Food Basket. On the clothing side, again, like I said, we have to use some kind of standard. And so the standard that we currently use that's in the 2008 base is from the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, and it's the acceptable level of living basket. So this basket, again, describes clothing that's required for the same reference family that we have. It's meant to reflect the types of clothing that you need for work, recreational, and social events. It reflects a similar standard of living to that of the MBM. That is, it's targeted towards a modest, basic standard of living, not necessarily an extravagant one. Clothing and footwear for most occasions. And in their development of this, they receive significant input from low-income persons to help them develop this basket. Again, it's not meant to be a shopping list. It's meant to be a standard that we can use to get to a threshold that's in the area that we're looking for. Like the food component, we then collect prices for these clothing items. So the basket tells us what clothing items should be included and how often they're needed. So if a person needs 6 pairs of socks, we price out 6 pairs of socks. But for other items, that you only need once every couple of years, we would say, okay, you only need money for this every couple of years. Like if a parka is expected to last 3 years, then you would receive in the clothing component the price of a third of a parka. That's the way it would work. So the price data for the clothing component comes from 11 different cities, and that's applied to the full province. So this graphic shows you where the prices are picked up, and those are applied to the remaining parts of the provinces. So before going back to your questions, so here are some options that have been suggested to us. These are just essentially meant to be guides for us to talk around, because I'd like to know what your views are on these. So for the food, for example, we have the option of using a new National Nutritious Food Basket that would be associated with the new Canada Food Guide. So if you would have any views on that would be interesting for me to hear. And then likewise, the clothing basket, we could update it to a 2012 version from the same organization, which would be more recent as well. And of course, any other suggestions that you may have on us moving forward with the food and clothing components, I'd be very happy to hear them. I'll go back to the questions. Oh, thanks, Mary. So it was you doing the moving. Okay. Okay, there we are. So that's where we were at last. Cheryl, okay, so 100 to 500,000 is too large of a spread. I appreciate that. And I'll take note of your concern there. City of Calgary, will the 2018 MBM thresholds be used for the 2021 census? I can say almost certainly yes. Does other include health costs? So health costs are mostly included from the perspective of the disposable income, and I'll come back to that later on in the end. There are some products that you would think of in terms of health costs, but probably not the ones that you're thinking of, if I could say it that way. It would include like your regular stuff that you buy at the drugstore, like your ordinary. I'm thinking of Advil and those kinds of medicines, but as far as prescription medicines are concerned, they're dealt with in the MBM in a different place. So I'll come back to that. I see that Cape Breton is an MBM. Is that the county of Cape Breton or the island of Cape Breton? That's a very good question, Doug. I'm honestly not sure. I'd have to look into that. Yeah, I'm not sure. How would childcare costs be factored in? As Doug, if there's a municipality of Cape Breton, that would be my guess, but maybe that doesn't answer your question. How would childcare costs be factored in as the reference children are of school age? I'll come back to childcare costs. They're dealt with in a different part of the market basket measure, but it's a good question and one we get all the time. How do you decide when an item is part of the basket versus being part of non-discretionary spending? I would think both are considered as necessary expenses for a family, but those classified as non-discretionary spending might not apply to the entire population and might allow for more variance in the cost. Could you comment on the difference in the impact to an individual being considered in poverty? Okay, Ainsley. So Ainsley, I'll come back to that when I discuss the other component a little later in the presentation. Because it's actually done differently than the others. It doesn't quite, when I said before that the other component is meant to cover the cost of toiletries and paper products and toys and stuff like that, we don't actually price those things out individually. We assign an overall value for all of those things, and different people would spend that money in different ways. Larissa, what about childcare expenses for families with young children? So I'll come back to that. City of Calgary, we noticed when we were responding to the MBM online survey that the housing figures seem quite low for our community, particularly for smaller family size. Will there be any consideration for high cost of one-bedroom accommodation in specific communities like our own? The short answer is yes. Thank you for responding to the survey. It was noted, a number of people indicated that they felt that the housing values were low, particularly for smaller family sizes. So we are looking into that again. There's probably a number of underlying factors, related to, the fact that the base does need, it is being rebased, so it's time. So that will probably help quite a bit there. I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the shelter costs. The cost of healthy, nutritious foods vary seasonally. Yes, so the calculations do account for this. Our pricers go into the regions and price the food goods every month. With the new food guide, yep. So Andrew, that's exactly one of the options that we have on the table for discussion, and whether the new food guide would be reflected in the 2018 MBM. Back to the City of Calgary. Based on the figures provided in the MBM survey, it seemed like 1- and 2-person families would need to live with roommates to be able to afford housing at the dollar threshold provided. Is living with a roommate considered a modest basic standard for 1- or 2-person family? That's not explicitly the standard for the MBM, so we are, like I said before, we're hearing that especially for individuals living alone, or as cohabitating with other people that they're not related to, for example, that the rental values seemed very low in some places, in many places actually. So we're definitely looking into that, and we'll respond to that as part of the recommendations for the market basket measure going forward. For the clothing component, how is the increased cost linked to the fast turnover for younger children being calculated? So I'm not sure. I'm sorry, Chantal. I'm not sure I understand the question. If you could elaborate, maybe I'll catch up with you towards the end of this list. Region of Waterloo, yes, update both. Okay, thank you. Good feedback. Brian Watson, on location cost, how do you deal with the issue of availability? Inexpensive housing takes time to find, so expensive housing or poor quality may be required in the short term and raise the cost. Okay, let's come back to that when I talk about shelter. How are the prices? I lost it there. How are the prices adjusted for rural and northern or remote communities? Can you provide detail on this methodology? So basically, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is no specific adjustment for remoteness. Rural communities are treated the same way, regardless of whether or not they are north or remote presently. We have been receiving comments from people saying that there should be an accommodation or recognition of higher costs in remote communities. So we're going to look over that. Presently, the way it works is we try to compute the prices for rural areas in the province overall, and those are the prices that are used for all rural areas in that province. Will CDP be able to provide retrospective MBM data for previous census cycles? Not sure what that question means. Like, could we have MBM cycle data for previous cycles? Well, you can always use the MBM.
Sorry, that's a message for us too. Mike, do you want to reply to that? Because that's within our own CDP data.
I see. Oh, I get it. Okay, I sort of assumed all these questions were directed towards me, but now hearing that it's directed towards you makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, if it's, I mean, there's the issue of calculating the cost of living back in time. So if they are able to provide thresholds, then we would be happy to get the data.
Yeah, so as far as, to my knowledge, the MBM is available on the census back to the 2011 NHS program. So that kind of data is available for previous census cycles. Doug provides some more information on Cape Breton. Yeah, I would have to get back to you, Doug, on that. I'm really not that familiar with the geographies that you're talking about, but certainly it's something that we could figure out for you. Okay, so Chantel has a clarification here. As children grow faster, they will require clothing to be purchased more frequently. I see what you're getting at. So like an adult might only need 2 pairs of shoes a year, but a child needs 4 or 5 or 6. So that is reflected in the acceptable level of living basket in terms of the frequencies of replacement that's needed for the children. Now, as I said, it's geared towards a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old. So maybe the 9-year-old isn't as going through their shoes as fast as an infant or toddler would. From personal experience, I think they probably aren't, but that is the way it's currently done right now. Okay, so I think I'll move on. Thank you for these questions, and maybe I can ask Mary if at the end of this I can just have a log of all these questions so that I can think about them a little bit more afterwards and have a good record of it going forward of what we talked about here. I'll move on now. All right, thanks, Mary. I'll move on to talk about the shelter component. So most of the regional variation in the MBM thresholds come from differences in shelter costs. So you can see here and compare that to the graphic I showed you earlier. There's really quite a lot of variation in the shelter costs, and most of the differences across the regions come from the differences in shelter costs. A little bit comes from the transportation costs, and a little bit comes from the food costs. Of course, that's partly due to the way we calculate it, but we get a lot of variation due to the shelter component. So you can see that the shelter components, so these are based on still the old 2008 basket, or we shouldn't call it the old basket, it's the one we currently use. But it's the basket currently in use and the one that we're currently revising. And so you can see the shelter costs there for a family of 4. That would be, as stated on the next slide here, they're calculated for 2 and 3 bedroom serviced amenities, service units with some amenities for each MBM region. It includes the rent, utilities, and refrigerator, stove, washer, and dryer. So for apartments that don't include refrigerator, stove, washer, and dryer, those are added in to adjust the rent cost. Right now, for the 2008 basket, the data comes mostly from the 2006 census and is updated using the rental cost CPI. So that's obviously been pointed out to us as being a pretty clear place where to update the shelter costs, is to bring those prices more up to date. While the rental cost CPI brings them up to date to a certain degree, it certainly isn't as good as getting the newest rental cost data. The transportation component, the MBM includes a component, and the idea is to meet the basic transportation needs for work, school, shopping, and participation in community activities. It's the only component actually that has different that has a different nature depending on the region. In areas with a public transit system, the public transit component consists of transit passes and taxi trips. So specifically, for the reference family, it's 2 adult and 1 child transit passes, and then a handful of taxi trips for the year. I think they amount to I think 2 a month taxi trips. In areas without a public transit system, these be areas more outside of the larger cities, and in some of these, even some of the medium-sized cities, it would include the cost of purchasing, operating, and maintaining a 5-year-old car. So rural communities would have a different transportation component than urban communities under the existing methodology. A variety of different methods are used to determine the cost for these components. The costs of purchasing adult and child bus passes are collected directly from the transit authorities. And the car is currently priced out as the cost of owning and operating a Ford Focus. So we look at a number of different sources for prices of 5-year-old Ford Focuses, and then we set up a payment schedule so that car is paid off over 5 years, and a maintenance schedule and everything, and that would be the cost for, as well as gas, for operating in the areas that are deemed to need a car. So what are a few of the options for discussion or to stimulate some thought? Well, one of the ones that I just mentioned obviously would be to look at updating the shelter costs to the 2016 census data to make it a more realistic of the picture, you know, that we would see if we went out there and looked at the rental market today. And then maybe for transportation, an option would be to start thinking about what it really means to have transportation in the cities. I think it's worth considering the idea that it would be very difficult to do many of the activities required for a basic modest standard of living only using public transit in cities, especially considering, you know, we're talking in some cases about very large cities with quite a lot of sprawl. Where people are increasingly living in suburban communities and working in suburban communities, where there might be limited public transit access, but at the same time, you want to keep public transit in the system because it is an option, and it is a place where we want for people to go as well. So those are a couple of thoughts on the shelter and transportation components. Now, a little bit about what was talked about before was about sort of setting up prices for large and small families. So right now, the way it works is, as I've just shown you, you take the 4-person household, you find out what their shelter cost is, and then you use an equivalence to get equivalences for other family sizes. So that's one of the reasons why the shelter costs for a 1-person household end up looking smaller than I think what people would expect. So we're looking into that, and we're looking at, well, is that the right way of equivalizing, or maybe we should be doing it differently? Another possibility would be to, instead of just pricing out one shelter type for one particular family type, maybe we could price out shelter types for different sizes of families and use that instead of this equivalent scale, which seems to be partly underlying some of those numbers that you mentioned, especially from the people from the city of Calgary. So here I say any questions or comments before I continue. So I'll go back to to where I left off. Okay, so back to City of Calgary. For housing and transportation costs are the costs for unsubsidized options. We have both subsidized housing and subsidized public transit in our community, but believe that people who are not in poverty should be able to afford full cost options. That's actually a really good point, City of Calgary. I appreciate the second part of that as well. The answer to your first question is they're based on unsubsidized options. So before we calculate what the shelter costs are, we remove all of the shelters that are subsidized. So it's based on unsubsidized costs. But I appreciate that, your point that people who are in poverty should be able to afford full cost options. That sort of resonates back to that point that I made at the very beginning of whether or not we want to accommodate somehow differently for people that are on rent geared income units. So I appreciate that comment. From Doug, transit service in Cape Breton Regional Municipality only serves a portion of its geography. Yeah, so that's true of many of the transit services. I can't say for sure whether Cape Breton uses in the model for transportation, whether it uses the car or the public transit options. But it could be that in the future, if I was to say, like, as I think I suggested here, let me just go back to this hybrid option for transportation. It could be that some mixture of both a public and a private transit costing could be an option for the future, so that we can more fully reflect what people actually use in terms of their public and private transportation needs. Ainsley, no, it actually doesn't presently take into account the cost of taking cabs in rural areas. In rural areas, the transportation component is based upon the idea of owning a car. So the idea being, I guess, if you own a car, you don't need to take a cab. But obviously, that's an oversimplification. People in low income in a rural community may not be able to afford a reliable vehicle. Yeah, so I understand where you're coming from there. It could be that. Again, there are places in the market basket measure where we have to make choices, and it can be parsimonious sometimes, and it doesn't really reflect everybody's particular needs, but hopefully over the population it reflects needs more in general. Is any transportation outside of the local area included in the transportation costs? So that's a really good point. You get the rest of your question here. It may be reasonable for people to visit out-of-town family once per year. So that particularly is not part of the transportation costs right now. In the other component, which I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes, there is some latitude for holidays. So some costs of sort of small holidays could be incorporated, which may or may not reflect exactly what you're talking about here. Could you add a cost of living percentage to the 2016 shelter cost if it's used for 2018 base? That's exactly what we do, Ruth. So we establish the baseline, and then we inflate it either using real prices that we go out and measure, or using different price indexes. So when we establish the 18 base, we'll be able to carry that forward for a number of years using inflation rates that are appropriate for those particular components. It's just as you get farther and farther away from the base, that's when you want to start thinking about rebasing, because it's time to make a new measurement, if you will, from time to time. Ivan, thank you for your feedback there. Ryan, have you worked backward to determine what income would be needed to earn to generate the disposable income in the MBM? Looks like in Halifax, a family of 5 would need to earn $50,000 pre-tax per year. Oh, that could be right, Brian. I haven't looked at that, but it could be a good idea. Like that, some sort of guidance like that could help communities to better understand what the needs are for people relative to the MBM. If we were to say the MBM threshold is, as you suggest, 40,000, but for a family, it would take about 50,000 in pre-tax to have that. Well, if people are better aware of their pre-tax income than their post-tax income, then that information would be useful. Could you indicate how distance traveled and fuel costs are estimated for the rural areas? Andrew, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is in the methodology. So I think that there's a certain annual allocation of number of kilometers. But again, like I said, it doesn't reflect remoteness. So whether you're very far away and you have to drive a long way, or relatively close, but it's still in rural areas, it would be the same. So that's something we could look at. Yeah, including small holidays in the other category. Thank you. Are we planning to add a cost of home ownership? Okay, so I'll come back to the cost of home ownership in just a minute because it factors in somewhere else in the MBM. And I got one eyeball on the time here, and I think we're doing well, but I don't want to keep you past your allotted times. So there are two big chunks of the MBM left to cover. One is the other component, and the other one is, broadly speaking, what we do with the disposable income. So I'll cover off both of those. That'll be my last 5 slides or so, and then we'll have a wrap up after that. Okay, so the other component is meant to cover other goods and services not covered by the previously discussed components, but are generally considered to be necessities. It does not use prices like the other parts of the MBM. Like, we don't try to define the 1,000 other things a family needs to get by and go out and price all of them. What we do instead is we set it as a fixed proportion of the food and clothing baskets. So this other component, which is you see from this graphic, which is a little over 30% of the, or a little under 30% of the total value of the MBM, is set based upon a fixed proportion. This fixed proportion was in the past, for the 2008 base, derived from data from the Survey of Household Spending. And what it did was it looked at a number of expenditure categories which were deemed to be important. And then those expenditure categories were expressed as a proportion of how much people were spending on food and clothing. And that proportion was about 75% at that time. So that 75% then is then taken over into the basket, if you will, and multiplied against the food and clothing baskets to come up with this other component. So it's a statistical method that we use, and of course there's quite a number of assumptions built in there. And so a part of the comprehensive review is looking at, is this still an appropriate way to do it? Do we have all of the data pieces that we would need to do it going forward? I'll go down to the next slide here because I sort of am stating ahead of time some of the options. You know, so certain items such as telecommunications be separated out from the other component. As you've seen there, there's no accommodation for cell phones or data plans or anything so far. They're all just kind of captured in the telecommunications aspect of the other component. So maybe we should be bringing them out and pricing them separately. And then there's, you know, should the other component be anchored to a set of goods other than food and shelter? So some people have suggested that anchoring that multiplier to food and shelter places excessive weight on food and clothing. I should say food and clothing, not food and shelter. Sorry for that typo. So it places maybe excessive weight on food as a driver of the MBM, and so to make it more general, it could be set to all of the goods and services, not just to food and clothing. And then, you know, should there be a new method for deciding on the multiplier? So there's a fair bit of work to do in the other component to update that. So once we have those 5 components on the one side, we add them up and we end up with the threshold. And then on the other, and then we need an income to compare that to. So we need a measure of income that sort of approximate what people have to spend on these goods and services that we have in the basket. And so for the market basket measure, we have something called the disposable income concept. And so for a family to be in poverty, its disposable income must be less than the threshold amount for its family size and region. So what we have here is we have the MBM disposable income is equal to a family's after-tax income. So this is after federal and provincial taxes. And then we make a number of adjustments to it. So we subtract out payroll taxes, so the ones that are associated with Canada Pension Plan and EI. We subtract out childcare expenses. So these are childcare expenses that are mostly reported by people through the tax system in order to reduce their taxes. Likewise, we subtract medical expenses, and the medical expenses are also gathered through the tax system that people are reporting to us. This is registered pension plan contributions. So these are people who have private pension plans and are investing in a registered pension plan, as well as union dues. And then there's some accommodation for support payments that people may be receiving from a partner or spouse. And then the last one, health insurance premiums. There we go. It's very small on my screen as well. So any health insurance, like provincial health insurance premiums that people are paying, are also subtracted. And then what's added to that is what we call a mortgage-free advantage. So this is a component that's meant to accommodate for the fact that some people are homeowners and some people are renters, and the cost of living. Oh, thank you. The cost of living for homeowners might be lower because they don't have to pay rent, especially if they've paid off their entire mortgage. So we do calculate a small amount, which is the differences that we observe in the data in the shelter costs between renters and homeowners without a mortgage, and it's an amount that we add in here, and we call it a mortgage-free advantage. So that way we don't. That way the disposable income is reflecting both what people have to spend, but also it reflects their needs a little bit, because people who own mortgage-free have lower shelter costs than people who rent. So a number of options for disposable income would include, should we change the treatment for childcare? So some people have said that putting childcare as an expense rather than as a basket item or a need sort of doesn't resonate well with them. They would prefer to see childcare represented as a basket item and something that was costed out more directly. So I appreciate that, and so we could look into that. Should we change the treatment for home ownership? Some people disagree with the idea that the mortgage-free advantage should be added in. It's not. I think it was the City of Calgary made the point a little earlier about people should be able to afford given what they have on the rent geared to income side. It's sort of the same argument would apply here. People should be able to afford or not afford based upon their income, and not necessarily thinking about this mortgage-free advantage adjustment. Are there other necessary expenses that could be added here? It would be interesting to hear from you on. And should we change the methodology to allow for disposable income to be computable with administrative data alone? This last one might seem like a kind of a weird question to some of you, but a lot of this data comes from administrative data strictly. Some of it comes from survey data, and with some small changes to the methodology, it could be that we could make the MBM computable with some of our large administrative data banks, like the T1 family file or the longitudinal administrative data bank. And some users have indicated that would be very helpful for them. So I'll sort of ask some big questions. Thinking about all aspects of the MBM. What changes to the MBM you think are most important? What's your advice to Statistics Canada as we work towards a new 2018 base MBM? And something that I'm interested in is, how do your organizations use or plan to use the MBM? While you're thinking about those questions, I'll come back up and catch up on the questions that you've already posed to me. So we'll pick it up from Valentin here again. So are you planning to add a cost of home ownership? So that's what the mortgage-free advantage does, in sort of in a way, by finding the difference between what it costs to be a homeowner and a renter. What it doesn't do completely is it doesn't account for the extra costs faced by homeowners with a mortgage. So there's no accommodation for homeowners with a mortgage in the MBM. So if, for example, interest payments or interest rates go up, and that affects homeowners with a mortgage, that there's no way right now that can be registered in the MBM. But it could be that that's something that we look to address in the future. Do shelter other costs include home internet usage? So that's presently included in the other component. So the amount that would be called the other component in the basket would include the communications costs. But as I said, that's sort of it's not priced out specifically. So there could be some advantages to pricing it out specifically. I know that these costs vary quite highly regionally, and so there could be some value to doing that. Do the shelter costs include any of the following? So utilities, yes. Property taxes, yes. Insurance, yes. And condo fees, yes. So they're all included for the utilities, yes. Are home repairs included in other or shelter? So home repairs, because it's not assumed that renters are repairing their own homes, it's not included in the shelter component. But some accommodation for home repairs could be reflected in the other, and some accommodation for it is reflected in the mortgage-free advantage that I mentioned at the end. Doug, thank you for your feedback here. And Ainsley, consider the push in some regions for free vision screening. Should there be consideration of the cost of vision care? Screening is free, glasses are not. That's a good point, Ainsley. We could add that to our list of things to consider, because obviously we're not picking it up now. Actually, I'm not 100% sure. I shouldn't say that, because when I talked about the other component is based upon a fairly lengthy list of other expenditures. So there could be some reflection of the cost of glasses in the other component. But again, would it be worthwhile to make it explicit and price it out clearly would be, I think, a good question to ask. Have you taken into account that many people may not report their healthcare expenses on their taxes? So that's something we're thinking about now. So yes, you're right. Those expenses wouldn't be fully accounted for. What we do presently is we do calculate from the Survey of Household Spending data a small amount that applies to everybody to account for an average healthcare expense, but it doesn't necessarily account for the specifics of everybody's situation. Okay. Post-secondary costs, loan repayments, tuition, and textbooks. So loan repayments aren't included. Textbooks, tuition are, but they're included in the other component as well. So like I said before, with the other component, it's sort of a large amount. It's meant to reflect the cost of these things, and it is used in the calculation to get to that 75%. Does the MBM account for income tax benefits that families' children qualify for, or that a single working minimum wage job on social assistance would not be eligible for? This would lower their comparable income level. Does the rebasing consider variations in family structure? Okay, so there's two parts to the question. So right now, the rebasing hasn't started to consider variations in family structure. It potentially could in the future. I sort of am aware that I'm saying a lot potentially could in the future, and I'm really starting to get concerned about how often I'm saying that. And so I want to come back to something here at the bottom. Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning that we have funding to do this review, and then we have funding for ongoing research, and that we expect that the market basket measure would be updated every 5 years. So we may not, like, obviously there's a lot of things here, and we're hearing these from a lot of different organizations and people. There's a lot of things to tackle. It might not be possible to tackle all of them in the time that we have. So what our intention is to try our best to reflect everything that's possible in this version of the rebasing, but then to continue to study ways that we can continue to improve the MBM between the 2018 base and the 2023 base. So part of the comprehensive review is about identifying what can be done right away, and part of it is about what needs to be studied more. So coming back to Ainsley's question, just the idea of sort of different elements, loan payments, tuitions, textbooks, those kinds of things, I think we might not be able to know what to do with them right away, but we could see these things becoming part of the research agenda going forward. Relating to an earlier question, it is a challenge for local politicians to understand why MBM can't be a program eligibility threshold, since it is the official poverty line. Currently, we use LIM AT, which is easy to show it would be good for StatCan to explain why MBM isn't useful or done for that purpose. We do say that when we're asked it directly, so maybe it could become part of our metadata going forward. We could talk about that directly as being, well, what would be some of the shortcomings were the MBM to be used as a threshold for program eligibility. We'll make note of that, and we could consider putting that in our metadata as we go forward. Currently use LICO as the basis for the minimum wage. We looked at the MBM, but was not helpful. Maybe an improved MBM might help. Also, I think we need a pre-tax and after-tax MBM like LICO. Well, that's an interesting idea. So right now, MBM is just based on the disposable income. Maybe to apply the MBM to different income definitions would be useful as well. It's an interesting point. Are dental costs included anywhere? What about orthodontics? I'm thinking that dental costs are included in the computation of that 75% for the other multiplier, but I don't think they're specified specifically like other items such as shelter and transportation. It'd be the same with orthodontics as well. What are the costs for private health insurance? Where are the costs for private health insurance included? They're included as a deduction from, through employer or individually. So I think that only provincial health insurance is included. I'm not sure that there's any deductions for employer or individual private health insurance in the MBM. Although I could be wrong there, but I don't think there is. Childcare costs should factor in that only a small fraction of the population has them within a short period of time. Yeah, that's part of what makes it difficult. That's sort of why it's not a recurring cost like food or shelter. And that's a really good point, Matt Kay. And I think that's the reason why the original designers of the MBM chose to deduct it from disposable income. In a sense, it's sort of an elegant solution to a very difficult problem, which is whom specifically and how and where to apply childcare costs in a basket. It might just seem easier to deduct it from the income based upon the data that you have for every individual. So that's a good point, Matt Kay, and we had thought about that, and I think that's partly why people are thinking we're thinking about it as a deduction from disposable income.
Sorry, Andrew, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We are at 2:30.
Oh, your organization planning on using MBM?
I just pause for a minute because I know some people will be moving on to their next part of their day, and thank you very much to Andrew. And please, before you log off, if you can just take a second to answer that question about how you plan to use the MBM. This is a real chance to get your feedback directly to Andrew. So please type as many comments as you would like down in that chat box. We're not going to get time to finish them all today, but I will make sure they get into Andrew's hands. And certainly if you write them out there, they will be easier to pass on and make sure that they get included. If not in this review, but maybe in the work plan or over time in this research model that's going to happen. And I'll just say thank you very much to Andrew. This has been fantastic to have a chance to get all these very particular questions answered. I know that these folks appreciated it. All of our members will love to get a chance to go through these slides some more and hear all these comments.
Okay, well, you're very welcome. I think I will follow your lead there and maybe just take my leave as well, although I could stay here. But I think probably the best thing to do is if there's a way of leaving this alive for a little while and just collecting any other comments that people may have.
Absolutely,
and if you could send them to me, I could put down quick responses and send them back through you, Mary.
And we will let Andrew take leave of us. But we won't let him go too far, and we will continue this discussion, and hopefully he will come back and speak with us again at the Community Data Program as we get further on with the update of the market basket measure.
That's great. Thanks, Mary. And thanks to everyone that participated and all of your very excellent questions and comments. On that last slide is a sort of a generic inbox for our market basket measure consultation. Sorry, it's so long, English and French. But please do contact us with any additional thoughts that you may have later.
Stay safe.
We are looking at everything that we receive right now.
I think she's heading home before the winter storm hits Pickering. I think Toronto's all getting hit. Ottawa's going to get something. I'm sitting out in Vancouver Island, and we had no snow last week, and now have about 3 feet of snow. So we're getting dumped on here, and we don't have fancy things like, you know, real snow plowing out here. So we're kind of tucked into our snow, and I hope everybody else is staying safe as well. So thanks very much. And like I said, I will keep this chat box open. Please do just take that minute and just write out your answer to that question. How do you plan to use the MBM? Or how is it limiting you in what you would like to use it for would also be another part of that question. So thanks very much, Andrew, and we'll speak to you soon. Thanks everyone for participating. We'll see you next time.